She broke a royal goblet by accident and braced for punishment. Instead, she was sent to serve the most feared prince in the land. Everyone warned her he was dangerous, cold, impossible to love. What she didn't know, the moment he saw her, something in him changed forever. Claire's hands were still shaking when the goblet slipped. It happened so fast that nobody in the great hall had time to react. 1 second, she was carrying it carefully across the marble floor, weaving between dancing nobles at King William's celebration, and the next it was crashing against the stone steps, shattering into pieces that scattered like broken stars. The music stopped. The ancient goblet had belonged to the royal family for 6 generations. It wasn't just glass and gold. It carried old magic, the kind people whispered about, but rarely understood. And now it lay in ruins at Claire's feet. "It was an accident," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tripped. I didn't mean." "An accident that dishonors this entire court," snapped Lady Beatrice, one of the king's most trusted advisers, though her true motives had little to do with honor. She had wanted Claire dismissed from the castle for months, ever since the young maid had caught her stealing coin from the kitchen accounts. Other nobles nodded along, their faces tight with manufactured outrage. Within minutes, whispers turned into demands, and demands reached the king's ears. King William sat on his throne, his expression unreadable as he studied the trembling girl before him. Claire had served in his castle since she was 12 years old. She'd never caused trouble. But the court was watching, and a king who showed weakness invited chaos. "There must be punishment," Lady Beatrice pressed. "Something the entire kingdom will remember. Something worse than prison." The king's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the dark line of mountains in the distance where the Fae lands began. An idea formed, cold and final. "Send her to Thornwood Castle," he said. "Let her serve Prince Ethan Ashwood for the rest of her days." A collective gasp swept through the hall. Everyone had heard of Prince Ethan. The stories varied depending on who told them, but they all ended the same way, with fear. Some said he was cursed by his own bloodline. Others said his castle swallowed anyone foolish enough to enter uninvited. Nobles joked that being sent to Thornwood was worse than execution, because at least death was quick. Claire felt the blood drain from her face, but she said nothing. Arguing would only make things worse. By that afternoon, she was standing at the edge of the Evergreen Pass, a thick wall of ancient trees separating the human kingdom from the Fae realm. Sir Caleb, one of the few guards who had always treated her kindly, walked beside her, his expression troubled. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "Maybe the stories are exaggerated." "Maybe," Claire replied, though her fingers were trembling around the small bag she carried. They walked for hours through the pass, the forest growing darker and stranger with every step. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes. The air smelled faintly of something sweet and cold, like frost mixed with flowers. By the time night fell, they reached it, Thornwood Castle, rising from the mist like a mountain of black stone, its towers disappearing into low-hanging clouds. Claire had expected fear to swallow her whole once she saw it. Instead, she felt strangely calm, the same stillness one feels standing at the edge of something inevitable. The castle doors opened before Sir Caleb even reached them. Prince Ethan Ashwood stepped into the torchlight, and Claire finally understood why people spoke of him in hushed voices. He was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in dark robes that seemed to absorb the light around him. But it wasn't his appearance that made the servants behind him flinch. It was the faint, pulsing glow beneath his skin, like veins of trapped lightning barely contained. Everyone expected him to look at Claire the way a predator looks at prey. Instead, the moment his eyes met hers, something shifted. The glow beneath his skin, the one that had pulsed angrily for years, went still. For the first time since anyone in that castle could remember, the curse quieted. Ethan's breath caught. He said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at the girl in front of him as if she were a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. Then he turned to his servants, his voice low but firm. "She is not to be harmed. Not by anyone, for any reason. Prepare a room for her, one of the good ones, near the east wing." Confused whispers spread through the hallway. This wasn't how punishment was supposed to look. Claire glanced at Sir Caleb, who looked just as baffled as she felt. Whatever she had expected from Thornwood Castle, it wasn't this. As she stepped through the towering doors, the ancient stone seemed to hum faintly beneath her feet, as though the castle itself had been waiting for her arrival. Morning light crept through tall windows Claire hadn't expected to find in a castle so widely feared. She had imagined dungeons and cobwebs, not sunlit halls with polished floors and quiet gardens tucked behind glass doors. The room Ethan had given her was warm, filled with soft blankets and a fireplace that never seemed to go cold. A young servant girl named Mira brought her breakfast that first morning, though she kept glancing at Claire like she wasn't sure whether to be afraid of her or curious about her. "Everyone's talking about what happened last night," Mira admitted, setting down a tray of bread and fruit. "Nobody's seen the prince react like that. Ever." "React like what?" Claire asked. Mira hesitated, then shook her head. "It's not my place to say. But you should know, the prince isn't what people think he is." Over the following days, Claire began to understand what Mira meant. Ethan wasn't cruel. He wasn't even distant. Not really, though he clearly preferred solitude. Most of his time was spent in the castle's library, a massive circular room stacked floor to ceiling with books so old their spines had turned soft with age. Claire caught glimpses of him there during her chores, always surrounded by scattered notes, his expression heavy with concentration. She learned from the other servants that the prince rarely slept more than a few hours a night. He was searching for something, they said, though nobody knew exactly what. Claire wanted to ask him directly, but something about his quiet intensity made her hesitate. Instead, she focused on her new duties, tidying rooms, tending the small castle garden, and slowly growing used to a life that felt less like punishment and more like an unexpected pause from everything familiar. Then, on the 5th day, curiosity got the better of her. While searching for extra linens, Claire wandered into a part of the castle she hadn't explored, a narrow hallway tucked behind the west staircase, dimly lit and colder than the rest of the castle. At the end of it stood a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. She should have turned back. Instead, she pushed it open. The room inside took her breath away, though not in a good way. Thick black vines crawled across every wall, pulsing faintly with the same eerie light she'd seen beneath Ethan's skin the night they met. The air felt heavier here, thick with something she couldn't name, sadness, maybe, or exhaustion that had settled so deep into the stone it never left. Claire took a cautious step forward, drawn to the vines despite the warning bells ringing in her mind. Without thinking, she reached out and touched one gently. The vine shuddered, then dimmed. Not brightened, not reacted with anger. It simply faded, as if her touch had eased something painful. "You shouldn't be here." Claire spun around to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable but his eyes wide with something close to disbelief. She braced herself for anger, but none came. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just—" "What did you do?" he interrupted, stepping closer, his gaze fixed on the vine she had touched. "I only touched it. I didn't mean any harm." Ethan studied the vine, then looked back at her, his jaw tightening. "That vine has pulsed like that for over a decade. I've never seen it calm before." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Not once." Claire didn't understand what he meant, but the seriousness in his voice made her stomach twist with unease. "Is something wrong with me?" "No," he said quickly, his tone softening. "No, nothing is wrong with you." He hesitated, glancing at the vines one final time before ushering her out of the room. "This chamber isn't safe. Please, don't return here." That night, Claire lay awake, replaying the moment over and over. She thought about the calm that had settled over Ethan's curse the night they first met, and now this. Vines quieting beneath her touch as though her presence alone eased whatever pain lived inside this castle. She didn't know it, but on the other side of the castle, Ethan sat alone in his library, staring at an old book left open on his desk. Faded illustrations showed vines just like the ones in the cursed chamber, alongside a passage written in a language few could still read. He had studied it 100 times before, always assuming it was nothing more than an old legend, a story told to comfort children rather than an actual truth. But now, for the first time, he wondered if the legend might be real. He thought of Claire's hand resting gently against the vine, and the way the curse, the same curse that had haunted him since childhood, had simply gone quiet, as if it recognized something in her that even he didn't fully understand yet. He knew he should tell her. She deserved to know why her presence affected the curse the way it did. But he also knew that legends like this one came with warnings. Warnings about cost and sacrifice. About gifts that healed at a price too heavy for anyone to carry alone. Until he understood exactly what her presence meant, and what it might eventually demand from her, he decided to say nothing. For now, he would simply watch and wait, and hope that whatever strange magic connected them wouldn't come with consequences neither of them was ready to face. 3 days after the incident in the cursed chamber, Ethan found Claire in the garden, pulling weeds from around a patch of frostbitten roses that refused to bloom no matter the season. "I need you to come with me somewhere," he said, without any of his usual hesitation. "There's someone who might understand what happened between you and the vine." Claire brushed the dirt from her hands and stood, studying his face for any sign of what this meant. "Am I in trouble?" "No," he said, and for the first time, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Quite the opposite, I think." They left the following morning, traveling by horseback through parts of the Fae realm Claire hadn't imagined existed. The stories back home painted this land as dark and lifeless, ruled by cruelty and shadow. But as they rode, Claire saw quiet villages tucked into rolling hills, children laughing as they chased fireflies that glowed even in daylight, and waterfalls that seemed to fall upward as often as they fell down. "It's beautiful here," she admitted, watching sunlight scatter across a field of silver grass. "Nobody back home ever told me that." "Fear spreads faster than truth," Ethan said quietly. "It always has." By late afternoon, they reached Silver Lake, a body of water so still and clear it looked more like glass than anything liquid. At its edge stood a modest stone cottage, covered in climbing flowers that shimmered faintly, as though lit from within. A woman stepped out to greet them before they even reached the door. She looked ageless, her silver hair braided over one shoulder, her eyes sharp with quiet wisdom. "Lady Rose." Ethan greeted her with a respectful nod. "Thank you for seeing us." "You wouldn't have written unless it mattered," Rose replied, her gaze shifting to Claire with open curiosity. "And judging by the look on your face, Ethan, I'd say this matters quite a lot." Inside the cottage, shelves lined every wall, filled with scrolls, dried herbs, and books far older than anything Claire had seen in the castle library. Rose examined Claire carefully, asking her to describe exactly what had happened in the cursed chamber. When Claire finished, Rose fell silent, her expression thoughtful. "May I see your hand?" she asked. Claire offered it without hesitation. Rose turned it gently, tracing faint lines along her palm that Claire had never noticed before. Pale, almost invisible unless the light caught them just right. "These weren't here a week ago," Rose murmured. "They appeared after you touched the vine, didn't they?" Claire nodded, unsure how Rose could possibly know that. Rose rose from her seat and retrieved an ancient scroll from the highest shelf, unrolling it carefully across the table. Faded illustrations showed figures with markings identical to the ones on Claire's palm, standing beside twisted, dying trees that bloomed the moment they were touched. "This," Rose said, "is called the gift of renewal. It's spoken of in only a handful of surviving texts, and even then, mostly as legend. Those born with it carry the ability to heal magic that has turned toward decay, curses, corrupted enchantments, even wounds within the earth itself." Ethan's expression shifted, equal parts wonder and dread. "That's why the curse calmed the moment she arrived." "Yes," Rose said, "and why the vines quieted beneath her touch. Her presence alone soothes decay. Direct contact heals it entirely." For a moment, hope flickered across Ethan's face, brighter than Claire had seen since they'd met. But Rose's expression remained cautious, and she held up a hand before he could speak. "There is a cost," she said carefully. "The gift of renewal doesn't simply erase decay, it absorbs it. Every time it's used to heal something significant, it draws from the bearer's own life force. Used carefully, in small amounts, it causes little harm. But a curse as old and deeply rooted as yours, Ethan, healing that completely could drain her far more than she could safely recover from." The room went quiet. Claire looked down at her palm, at the faint markings that had appeared without her permission, wondering what it meant to carry power she never asked for. "How much would it take?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "To heal the curse completely?" "I don't know," Rose admitted. No text describes a curse quite like yours, but I would advise against finding out through trial alone. Some cures cost more than the disease itself. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the faint scars on Claire's hand as though seeing them for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty Claire hadn't heard from him before. Then we won't use her gift. Not unless there's truly no other option left. Ethan, Claire started, but he shook his head. I've carried this curse for years, he said. I won't let it take anything from you in exchange for my relief. We'll find another way. Rose watched the exchange with quiet interest, though she said nothing more on the matter. Instead, she rolled the scroll closed and handed it to Ethan. There may be other paths, she said. Older solutions, buried deeper in Fae history. I suggest you start by searching closer to home. Sometimes the answers we search for the farthest are hiding right beneath our feet. Neither of them realized how literally true her words would turn out to be. As they left Silver Lake that evening, the sky burning orange above the water, Claire glanced at Ethan, who rode beside her in thoughtful silence. For the first time since arriving at Thornwood Castle, she didn't feel like a punishment being carried out. She felt like part of something neither of them fully understood yet, but something neither of them wanted to lose. The ride back to Thornwood Castle took 2 full days, and by the time they arrived, something between Claire and Ethan had quietly shifted. They spoke more easily now, the silences between them comfortable instead of strained. Claire found herself watching him differently too, not as the frightening prince from old stories, but as someone carrying a burden far heavier than anyone realized. Still, Rose's warning stayed with her, a cost too heavy to ask for. She thought about those words constantly, turning them over like a stone in her pocket, wondering exactly how heavy that cost might be. A few days after their return, Claire found herself with a rare afternoon free of chores. Restless and curious about Rose's parting words. Sometimes the answers we search for the farthest are hiding right beneath our feet. She decided to explore parts of the castle she hadn't yet seen. She started in the lower levels, past the kitchens and the old storage rooms, where the air grew cooler and the stone walls older. She was searching for nothing in particular, just a forgotten linen closet Mira had mentioned, when she noticed something odd, a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest. Its stones fitted a little too neatly, as if placed there long after the original structure was built. Claire pressed her palm against it out of curiosity. The stone shifted beneath her touch, grinding slowly aside to reveal a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. She hesitated only a moment before grabbing a torch from the wall and descending. The stairs seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder with every step, until she finally emerged into a wide, circular chamber unlike anything she'd seen in the castle above. Unlike the cursed room with its twisted vines, this space felt peaceful, ancient, but calm, as though it had been waiting patiently for centuries rather than suffering through them. Murals covered every wall, painted in colors that had barely faded despite their obvious age. Claire raised her torch higher, studying the images carefully. The first mural showed a Fae king kneeling before a swirling mass of shadow, offering something Claire couldn't quite make out. The next showed the same king growing older, weaker, while the shadow around him seemed to shrink in response. Generation after generation, the murals told the same story, kings and queens of Ethan's bloodline, each one sacrificing pieces of their own happiness, their own freedom, to keep the ancient curse contained. Claire's breath caught as she reached the final mural, one clearly more recent than the others. It showed a lone figure, isolated in a dark castle, carrying the weight of the shadow entirely alone. Ethan, I wondered how long it would take you to find this place. Claire turned quickly to find Ethan standing at the base of the staircase, his expression unreadable in the torchlight. She braced herself for anger, but instead, he simply walked further into the chamber, his eyes lingering on the murals as though seeing old wounds reopen. This is your family, Claire said quietly. All of them. They gave up so much. Every ruler in my bloodline has carried this curse in some form. Ethan explained, his voice heavy. Some carried it for a few years before passing it to the next generation. Others carried it for decades, sacrificing marriages, friendships, even their own children's futures, all to keep it from spreading beyond these castle walls. And you? Claire asked gently. How long have you carried it? Since I was 12, he admitted. My father believed isolating myself completely would prevent the curse from affecting anyone else. No close friends. No attachments. Nothing the shadow could threaten to take from me. Because grief and fear are what feed it most. Claire's chest tightened, pieces finally falling into place. That's why everyone was so afraid of you. Not because you were cruel, but because you'd shut everyone out so completely, nobody ever saw who you really were. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer to the final mural, tracing the edge of the painted shadow with his fingers. I always believed loneliness was the price of protecting others, he said quietly. That accepting anyone into my life again would only give the curse something new to threaten. And now? Claire asked. He turned to face her, something vulnerable flickering behind his usually guarded expression. Now I'm not so certain isolation was ever the answer. Not when the moment you arrived, the curse responded the way it did. Not when a stranger's kindness did more to calm it than years of solitude ever managed. Claire felt something warm bloom in her chest, though she quickly pushed the feeling aside, unsure what to do with it. Instead, she focused on the murals surrounding them, on the weight of generations sacrificed to a burden none of them had chosen. There has to be another way, she said firmly. One that doesn't require anyone giving up everything they love. Rose said the same thing, Ethan admitted. But no ruler before me has found it. Only ways to delay the inevitable. Then maybe, Claire said, meeting his eyes with quiet determination, it's time someone looked at this differently. Your family kept trying to fight the curse alone. Maybe that's exactly why none of them succeeded. Ethan studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his gaze. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close enough to matter. I promise you, Claire continued, I'll help you find another solution. One that doesn't cost you everything, and doesn't cost anyone else either. For the first time since she'd arrived at Thornwood Castle, Ethan allowed himself something dangerously close to belief. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet underground chamber, that the shadows painted across the final mural had begun to shift ever so slightly, as if the ancient curse itself had heard her promise and was already deciding how it planned to respond. Word travels fast in the Fae realm, faster than Claire ever expected. Within 2 weeks of their return from the underground chamber, whispers had already spread through Thornwood's staff, through nearby villages, and eventually, through the noble houses scattered across the kingdom. The prince's curse is weakening. Claire first noticed the change in how the castle servants treated her. Less caution now, more genuine warmth. Mira had started humming while she worked, something she admitted she hadn't done in years. Even the old stone walls seemed less heavy somehow, as though the entire castle had been holding its breath and had finally begun to exhale. But not everyone welcomed the change. Lord Vincent Blackwood arrived at Thornwood Castle uninvited, his expression carefully polite even as his eyes lingered too long on Claire whenever she crossed his path. He was an older noble, respected among the Fae courts for his sharp instincts and his careful, calculated words, the kind of man who never said exactly what he meant, but always made sure others understood his intentions anyway. A human girl, softening centuries of Fae magic, he remarked one evening, loud enough for several servants to hear. How curious. Claire tried to ignore him, but Ethan noticed the way Vincent's presence unsettled her. He won't cause trouble openly, Ethan assured her later that night. Vincent prefers to work in shadows, but we should be careful all the same. His warning proved accurate sooner than either of them expected. A few days later, Lady Rose sent word that a rare flower called the moon blossom, found only within the heart of the crystal forest, might help stabilize Ethan's curse naturally, without relying on Claire's gift at all. The flower bloomed only once every several years, and only under very specific conditions: moonlight, untouched earth, and complete stillness. It won't cure the curse entirely, Rose had written, but it may buy time. Time enough to search for a permanent solution without risking Claire's strength. Ethan and Claire set out for the crystal forest at dawn, following an old map Rose had provided. Neither of them noticed Vincent watching from a distance as they departed, his expression calculating rather than concerned. The forest itself was unlike anything Claire had ever seen. Trees made of pale, translucent crystal instead of wood, their branches chiming softly whenever the wind passed through them, like distant wind chimes made of glass. Sunlight scattered through the canopy in fractured rainbows, painting the forest floor in shifting colors. "It's like walking through a dream," Claire whispered. "A dream with teeth," Ethan replied, only half joking. The forest tests those who enter searching for the moon blossom. Old magic, meant to keep the flower from falling into careless hands. The first trial came quickly, a narrow bridge of crystal stretching across a deep ravine, glowing faintly with runes that pulsed with each step. Halfway across, the bridge split into two paths, one wide and inviting, the other narrow and unstable. "The wide path usually hides the trick," Ethan murmured, studying the runes carefully. "These trials favor patience over strength." Trusting his instincts, they took the narrow path instead, moving slowly and carefully until they reached solid ground on the other side. Behind them, the wide path collapsed entirely, crumbling into the ravine below. The second trial tested kindness rather than caution. A wounded Fae creature, small and frightened, blocking their way forward. Other travelers, Ethan explained, had tried forcing their way past it, only to find the forest turning hostile around them. Instead, Claire knelt down slowly, offering the creature a piece of bread from her satchel, speaking softly until it finally allowed them to pass. By the time they reached the heart of the forest, the moon had risen high above the crystal canopy, its light pooling around a single flower glowing softly in the clearing ahead, the moon blossom, exactly as Rose had described. But as Ethan reached to gather it carefully, a voice interrupted them from the shadows. "Careful," Vincent said, stepping into the clearing, his expression unreadable. "Legends say those who take the moon blossom for selfish reasons find the forest turns against them." "I'm not taking it for myself," Ethan replied evenly, though his shoulders tensed. "You know exactly why I'm here, Vincent." "Do I?" Vincent's gaze shifted toward Claire. "Or is this simply another excuse to justify a human's growing influence over Fae affairs?" "Claire has done nothing but help," Ethan said firmly. "The curse has weakened because of her presence, not because of anything selfish or dangerous." Vincent studied them both for a long, tense moment, clearly searching for some crack in Ethan's certainty. When he found none, his expression shifted into something colder, more calculating. "Perhaps," he said finally, "or perhaps the court simply hasn't asked the right questions yet." Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the crystal trees, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Claire released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "He's going to cause problems, isn't he?" "Probably," Ethan admitted, carefully wrapping the moon blossom in soft cloth. Vincent has never trusted change easily, especially change he can't control. As they made their way out of the forest, the crystal branches chiming softly around them, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent's quiet threat carried more weight than his careful words suggested. Somewhere behind them, deep within the shimmering trees, Vincent had already begun planning exactly how he intended to turn the Fae court against her. The moon blossom worked exactly as Rose had hoped. Within days of returning from the crystal forest, the faint glow beneath Ethan's skin had dimmed further, no longer pulsing with the restless energy that once kept him awake through the night. It wasn't a cure, but it was progress, and for the first time in years, Ethan slept peacefully. Claire noticed the change in more than just his curse. He laughed more easily now, teased Mira gently during breakfast, and occasionally sought Claire out simply to talk, with no particular purpose beyond enjoying her company. Thornwood Castle, once known throughout both kingdoms for its silence and shadow, had slowly begun to feel like a home. But peace, Claire was learning, rarely lasted uninterrupted in the Fae realm. 3 weeks later, castle staff began preparing for the Court of Seasons, an annual gathering where leaders from every Fae house convened at Thornwood to discuss matters affecting the realm. Ethan's family had hosted the event for generations, though in recent years, his isolation had made the gathering feel more like an obligation than a celebration. This year, word of Claire's presence had spread far beyond Thornwood's walls, and it was clear from the moment the first guests arrived that curiosity and suspicion had traveled with them. "They'll be watching you closely," Ethan warned her the morning of the gathering, especially after Vincent's little performance in the forest. "I'm not afraid of him." Claire said, though her stomach tightened slightly at the thought of standing before an entire court of Fae nobility. I know, Ethan said, a small, proud smile touching his lips. That's exactly why I'm not worried. The Great Hall had been transformed for the occasion, its usual quiet grandeur replaced with banners representing each of the Fae houses, tables lined with delicacies Claire had never seen before, and soft magical light drifting like fireflies near the vaulted ceiling. Despite the beauty of it all, tension crackled beneath the surface the moment nobles began arriving. Vincent wasted no time. Barely an hour into the gathering, he rose from his seat, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables with practiced ease. Many of you have heard the rumors, he began, his voice carrying easily across the hall, that Prince Ethan's centuries-old curse has weakened, not through Fae magic, not through ancient ritual, but because of a human girl serving in his castle. Murmurs spread through the room. Claire felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression calm, refusing to give Vincent the reaction he clearly wanted. I mean, no disrespect to Prince Ethan, Vincent continued, but I think we should ask ourselves, is it wise to entrust the safety of an entire realm to a girl none of us know? A human, no less, with no understanding of Fae history, Fae magic, or Fae consequence. Ethan rose to respond, but Claire gently placed a hand on his arm, silently asking him to let her handle this herself. Lord Vincent is right about one thing, Claire said, standing calmly despite the eyes now fixed entirely on her. I don't fully understand Fae history. I didn't grow up here, and I never expected to end up standing in this hall, let alone in the middle of matters as important as this. A few nobles exchanged surprised glances at her honesty. But I do understand kindness, Claire continued. I understand what it means to help without expecting anything in return. And I think, more than ancient bloodlines or old magic, that's exactly what this realm has been missing. Vincent's expression flickered with irritation. Pretty words rarely solve real problems. Then let actions speak instead, Claire replied evenly. Without waiting for permission, she walked toward the hall's far entrance, leading out into the castle's central garden, a space that had remained barren and lifeless for years, choked by remnants of Ethan's curse that even the moon blossom hadn't fully reached. The nobles followed, curious despite themselves. Claire knelt beside the withered roots of what had once been a magnificent tree, said to be centuries old, the tree of seasons, sacred to every Fae house present. Its branches were bare, its bark cracked and gray, a symbol many believed represented the slow decay creeping through the realm itself. Gently, Claire pressed her palm against its trunk. For a long moment, nothing happened. Whispers of doubt rippled through the crowd, and Claire felt her confidence waver. Then, slowly, warmth spread beneath her palm, traveling upward through the ancient bark. The tree shuddered and bloomed. Blossoms burst open along every branch, spreading outward in waves of soft pink and gold, until the entire tree stood transformed, vibrant and alive for the first time in decades. Gasps of amazement spread through the gathered nobles, several stepping back in stunned silence. Even Vincent, for once, said nothing. Ethan stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. This is what Claire has brought to Thornwood. Not danger, not foolish trust. Healing, freely given, without demand for anything in return. He turned to face the court fully, his tone firm and unwavering. Claire has earned her place here through her character, not through magic alone. I won't apologize for valuing that, and I won't allow anyone here to question her worth simply because she wasn't born within these lands. The nobles murmured among themselves, though the earlier suspicion had noticeably softened, replaced by cautious admiration. Even those who had arrived skeptical found it difficult to argue against a tree blooming brilliantly before their very eyes. Vincent remained silent for the rest of the gathering, though Claire caught him watching her carefully throughout the evening, his expression unreadable. Later that night, as the last of the guests departed and the castle finally quieted, Ethan found Claire standing alone beside the newly blossomed tree, moonlight scattering softly through its restored branches. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly, joining her. I wanted to, Claire replied. This castle deserves to bloom again. So do you. Ethan studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, warmer and more certain than either of them was ready to name aloud just yet. Neither noticed, far beyond the garden walls, Vincent standing alone in the shadows, his earlier doubt now replaced by something far more dangerous. Quiet, calculated resolve. Peace settled over Thornwood Castle in the weeks following the Court of Seasons, though Ethan remained cautious. The curse had weakened considerably, but it hadn't disappeared, and he knew better than to assume Vincent's silence meant the matter was settled. Still, there was progress to celebrate. Rose sent word shortly after the gathering. Having spent weeks digging through older Fae archives for anything that might explain the curse's true origin, I found something, her letter read. An old writing, mostly forgotten, referencing a place called the Shrine of First Light, hidden deep within the White Pine Mountains. It's said to hold the original record of how this curse began, and perhaps how it was always meant to end. Ethan didn't hesitate. Within days, he, Claire, Rose, and Sir Caleb, who had remained close to Claire since escorting her to Thornwood months earlier, set out toward the northern mountains, following a path so old it had nearly vanished beneath centuries of untouched snow. The journey was harder than anything they'd faced before. The White Pine Mountains stretched endlessly upward, their peaks disappearing into thick clouds, the air growing thinner and colder with every mile. Despite the difficulty, Claire found herself oddly at peace during the climb, surrounded by quiet valleys blanketed in snow, untouched by the noise and suspicion of the Fae court. "You've been quiet," Ethan noted one evening, as they made camp beside a frozen stream. "I've just been thinking," Claire admitted, "about everything that's happened since I arrived. None of it makes sense if I try to think about it too logically. And yet, somehow, it all feels right." Ethan sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Sometimes the things that make the least sense end up mattering the most. Claire smiled softly, though she said nothing more, unwilling to name the feeling settling steadily inside her chest. They reached the shrine on the fourth day, tucked into a hidden valley, so still it felt as though time itself had paused there. Unlike the grand castles and lively villages they'd passed through, the Shrine of First Light was simple, a modest stone structure, half buried beneath snow, its entrance marked by faded carvings that predated even Rose's oldest texts. Inside, the shrine was empty except for a single stone tablet resting at its center, untouched by time despite its obvious age. Rose examined it carefully, translating the ancient script line by line as the others waited in tense silence. "This confirms what I suspected," she said finally. "The curse wasn't created as punishment. It was created as a test." "A test?" Ethan repeated. "For what purpose?" Rose continued reading. "Centuries ago, the first Fae rulers grew afraid of losing their power to outsiders, to weakness, to change. They created the curse intentionally, believing that isolating their bloodline from attachment would keep the kingdom strong. But the shrine's writings suggest they misunderstood the very magic they used to create it." "Misunderstood how?" Claire asked. "The curse wasn't meant to be broken through sacrifice," Rose explained. "Every generation before you believed suffering alone would eventually satisfy it, that giving up happiness would somehow prove worthiness. But the tablet says the opposite. It was designed to end the moment someone chose hope over fear and trust over isolation." Ethan stood in stunned silence, staring at the tablet as though seeing his entire life reframed in an instant. "All this time," he said quietly, "every ruler before me believed loneliness was strength, that isolating themselves proved they were strong enough to protect everyone else. But it was never really about strength," Claire said slowly, understanding dawning in her voice. "It was about whether you'd let yourself trust someone else enough to share the burden at all." Ethan turned to face her, something breaking open behind his eyes. Years of guilt, loneliness, and quiet suffering finally beginning to make sense. "I spent so long believing accepting help would make me weak," he admitted. "That needing anyone was a danger to everyone around me. And instead," Claire said gently, "it's what could have saved you all along." Sir Caleb, who had remained quiet throughout the discovery, finally spoke. "It seems the real curse was never Fae magic at all. It was the belief that you had to carry everything alone." Rose nodded slowly, rolling up her notes with a satisfied, if cautious, expression. The tablet doesn't explain exactly how the curse will respond once that belief changes. Only that it will. Ethan looked around at the small group who had traveled with him. Claire, Rose, and Caleb, each of them choosing, without hesitation, to stand beside him through every difficult step of this journey. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully accept what that meant. "Then let's go home," he said quietly. "It's time I stopped carrying this alone." As they began their descent from the mountains, the sky above them clear and endless, Claire couldn't shake the quiet feeling that something significant waited for them back at Thornwood. Not danger, not exactly, but a final test neither of them could avoid much longer. Whatever it was, she realized, she no longer feared facing it. Not as long as she faced it beside Ethan. Thornwood Castle looked exactly as they'd left it, quiet, softened by early spring light, the tree of seasons still blooming brightly in the garden. But the moment Ethan stepped through the front gates, something shifted beneath his skin, sharp and sudden enough to make him stumble. Claire caught his arm before he could fall. "Ethan." He pressed a hand against his chest, breathing hard. Beneath his skin, the familiar glow had returned, brighter and more erratic than it had been in weeks. "It's reacting," he said through gritted teeth. "Stronger than before." Rose hurried to his side, her expression grave as she studied the pulsing light beneath his skin. "This isn't decay returning. This feels different, like the curse is preparing for something, not weakening from it." "Preparing for what?" Sir Caleb asked, alarm evident in his voice. Before Rose could answer, the ground beneath them trembled. Vines, the same dark, twisted vines from the cursed chamber, began creeping up through the garden soil, spreading rapidly across the courtyard, wrapping around the newly blossomed tree. "The final test," Rose murmured, realization dawning in her eyes. The tablet said the curse would end the moment belief changed. This must be its final response, testing whether that change is real or simply words spoken in a quiet mountain shrine. Ethan grimaced as the glow beneath his skin intensified, the vines spreading faster with every passing second, threatening to swallow the garden whole. Claire didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, kneeling beside the nearest vine, her palm hovering just above it. "Claire." "No," Ethan said sharply, reaching for her. "You heard what Rose said in Silver Lake. A curse this size could take everything from you." "I know," Claire said, meeting his eyes steadily. "But I'd rather risk myself than watch this destroy you after everything we've learned." "I won't let you," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "I refuse to trade your life for mine. I've spent this entire journey learning that isolating myself to protect others was never the answer. I won't make the same mistake by asking you to sacrifice yourself instead." "Then what do we do?" Claire asked, desperation creeping into her voice as the vines climbed higher, wrapping around the castle's stone pillars. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, memories from the shrine flooding back, trust over isolation, hope chosen freely, burdens no longer carried alone. Understanding settled over him, clear and certain. "We don't do anything alone," he said. "Not this time." He turned to Rose and Caleb, both of whom stood ready despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Stand with me," Ethan said. "Not to fight the curse. Just stand with me. All of you." Rose stepped forward without hesitation, taking a place beside him. Sir Caleb followed immediately after, his hand steady on Ethan's shoulder. "Claire," Ethan said softly, turning to her. "Not your gift. Just you." Claire understood instantly. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, choosing to stand beside him rather than sacrifice herself for him. Word spread quickly through the castle grounds, and one by one, servants began stepping into the courtyard despite the spreading vines. Mira first, followed by cooks, guards, and stable hands who had come to see Thornwood not as a place of fear, but as home. They gathered around Ethan, forming a quiet, steady circle, none of them offering magic or power, only their presence. The glow beneath Ethan's skin pulsed violently, vines thrashing as though sensing the shift happening around it. For a terrifying moment, Claire feared they had misunderstood the shrine's message entirely. Then, slowly, the light began to change. Instead of the sharp, angry glow that had haunted Ethan for years, it softened into something warmer, spreading gently rather than violently. The vines, which moments before had been choking the garden, began to shrink back, retreating into the earth as though finally releasing a breath held far too long. "It's working," Rose whispered, watching in amazement. Ethan looked around at the circle surrounding him, Claire's hand still firmly in his, Rose and Caleb steady at his sides, servants who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to stand beside their prince during his most vulnerable moment. "The curse was never about strength," he said quietly, understanding fully settling in. "It was about whether I'd allow myself to be loved without fear of losing everyone I cared about." As the last of the vines dissolved into the soil, the pulsing glow beneath his skin faded completely, leaving behind nothing but calm, steady warmth. For the first time since childhood, Ethan felt no trace of the curse lingering beneath his skin. The garden, moments ago chaotic and thorned, settled into stillness. Sunlight broke gently through scattered clouds, illuminating the newly restored Tree of Seasons, its blossoms more vibrant than ever. Claire turned to Ethan, relief and disbelief mixing across her face. "It's really gone." "I think so," Ethan said, voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. "For the first time in as long as I can remember, I feel free." He looked around at everyone gathered, friends, servants, people who had chosen him without needing anything in return, and understood, finally, what the shrine had truly meant. The curse hadn't been broken by sacrifice. It had been broken by everyone choosing, freely and without fear, to stand together. Claire smiled through unexpected tears, squeezing his hand gently. "You did it." "We did it," Ethan corrected softly, his gaze lingering on her with quiet certainty. "All of us. Together." As evening settled peacefully over Thornwood Castle, the garden glowing softly beneath a sky finally clear of shadow, Claire realized this wasn't just the end of a centuries-old curse. It was the beginning of something neither of them had dared imagine when she first arrived at Thornwood's gates, not as punishment, but as the start of a future built on trust freely given and love that asked for nothing in return. Spring turned into summer, and Thornwood Castle bloomed in ways nobody could have imagined a year earlier. The gardens that once held cursed vines now overflowed with color, flowers Claire hadn't even known existed climbing along walls that used to feel cold and unwelcoming. The castle itself seemed lighter somehow, sunlight reaching corners that had stayed shadowed for generations. Servants no longer whispered nervously about the prince's temper or feared knocking on his study door. Instead, laughter echoed through hallways that had once known only silence. Word of the curse's end spread quickly across both kingdoms. Travelers who once avoided the Evergreen Pass entirely now crossed freely between human and Fae lands, drawn by stories of a prince who had broken centuries of isolation not through power, but through trust. Small villages near the border began trading openly with Fae merchants for the first time in living memory, friendships forming where fear had once stood guard. Even Vincent, who had spent months searching for cracks in Ethan's judgment, eventually arrived at Thornwood Castle unannounced one afternoon, his expression uncharacteristically humble. "I came to admit I was wrong," he said simply, standing before Ethan and Claire in the newly restored garden. "I judged you before understanding you, and I judged her before giving her a fair chance. That was my mistake, not yours." Ethan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Apology accepted, Vincent. Though I'd suggest spending less time assuming the worst about people and more time actually getting to know them." Vincent allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first Claire had ever seen from him. "Wise advice. I'll try to remember it." As summer deepened, word reached Thornwood that King William himself intended to visit, a gesture unheard of in generations between human and Fae royalty. Claire felt a familiar nervousness return as the day approached, memories of that final night in the human castle, the shattered goblet, the frightened whispers, the punishment she'd never expected to survive, resurfacing unexpectedly. "You don't have to feel anxious," Ethan reassured her the morning of the king's arrival, noticing the tension in her shoulders. "Whatever happens, you're not the same girl who left that castle months ago." "I know," Claire admitted. "It's just strange, facing him again after everything that's changed." King William arrived with a modest procession, far smaller than the grand displays Claire remembered from royal celebrations back home. He looked older somehow, though his expression carried none of the coldness she recalled from the night he'd sentenced her to Thornwood. "I owe you an apology," he said, once formal greetings had been exchanged. "I sent you here as punishment, believing it the harshest sentence I could offer. I never imagined it would become something entirely different." "It's all right," Claire said, and found she meant it completely. "I understand why you made that decision, but I'm grateful for how everything turned out." The king studied the castle grounds around him, the blooming gardens, the warmth radiating from servants who moved freely without fear, the quiet strength visible in his once feared neighbor's expression. "It seems," he said slowly, "that what I intended as your greatest misfortune became the greatest blessing both our kingdoms could have asked for." That evening, after King William's procession departed and the castle settled into peaceful quiet, Ethan found Claire alone in the garden, standing beneath the fully blossomed tree of seasons, moonlight scattering softly through its branches. "I've been thinking," he said, joining her beneath the tree, "about everything that's happened since you arrived. The curse, the court, everything we discovered on that mountain." "So have I," Claire admitted, smiling softly. "It's strange, isn't it? How something meant to be so terrible ended up being the best thing that's ever happened to me." Ethan reached for her hand, his expression suddenly nervous in a way Claire hadn't seen from him since their earliest days together. "Claire," he said carefully, "you came to Thornwood as punishment, expecting nothing but hardship and fear. Instead, you brought healing to a curse centuries old, courage to a kingdom that had forgotten what trust looked like, and honestly, more warmth to my life than I ever believed I deserved." He knelt slowly before her, producing a delicate ring crafted from silver vines intertwined with small, glowing blossoms, clearly grown from the very garden they now stood in. "I don't want you to simply remain here out of obligation, or because circumstances brought you to my doorstep," he continued. "I'm asking you to stay because you want to, because this has become your home as much as it's always been mine. Claire, will you stand beside me, not as a servant, not out of punishment, but as my equal, my partner, and if you'll have me, my future queen?" Tears blurred Claire's vision, though for the first time since arriving at Thornwood Castle, they were tears of pure happiness rather than fear. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Yes, I'll stay. Not because I have to, but because there's nowhere else I'd rather be." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, rising to pull her into a gentle embrace beneath the softly glowing tree, the entire garden seeming to bloom brighter in response to the promise exchanged between them. Months later, Thornwood Castle hosted a celebration unlike anything either kingdom had witnessed before. Humans and Fae standing together, sharing food, laughter, and stories beneath banners representing both worlds finally united in peace. Claire stood at the center of it all, dressed not as a servant sentenced to endless labor, but as a future queen who had earned her place through kindness, courage, and an unshakable belief in second chances. As the celebration continued late into the night, Claire found Ethan's hand in hers once more, both of them watching quietly as fireflies drifted lazily above the blossoming garden that had once been cursed beyond hope. "Do you ever think about that night?" Claire asked softly. "The night the goblet broke, and everything changed." "All the time," Ethan admitted, smiling gently. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small ended up changing both our lives so completely." Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the garden glow softly beneath a sky full of stars. "I used to think it was the worst thing that ever happened to me," she said quietly. "Now, I think it might have been the best." And beneath the ancient tree of seasons, surrounded by a kingdom finally free of shadow, Claire and Ethan began their new life together, not as punishment and not as fate, but as a promise freely chosen, in a home they had built together, one act of courage and kindness at a time.